Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 5, we're asking how does tackling SDG 8.7 and the fight to end modern slavery by 2030 work with the UN's other sustainable development goals to create a better and more sustainable world for us all. I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Siddharth from the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard Kennedy School, the FXB Center at Harvard, and who will be joining the University of Nottingham in October as the British Academy Global Professor of Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. Siddharth is a writer, researcher, and activist on modern slavery who has worked in more than 50 countries to document the lives of modern slaves. I'm also delighted to be joined by Hannah Lerigo-Stephens, who leads on the monitoring, evaluation, and learning work at the Rights Lab here at the University of Nottingham. Hannah has worked with leading food retailers like the Co-op and Morrissons to improve labor standards in their global supply chains, and now helps translate research evidence from the Rights Lab into useful resources for businesses and organizations looking to work ethically and sustainably. Thank you for joining us, and today we're asking how SDG 9, which seeks to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation, interact with the ambitions of SDG 8.7 to put an end to modern slavery. So that sounds like a mouthful there. I wanted to turn directly to Siddharth in the first instance and really just ask a little bit about the work you've been doing over the years. You've been in 50 countries, you've been on the ground documenting the lives and stories of modern slaves. Could you just give us a little bit of a flavor of the work that you do abroad in fighting modern slavery?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Todd. As you mentioned, I have been traveling around the world for quite some time now, just over 20 years, in fact, to many countries to document conditions under which individuals work in forced labor, child labor, modern slavery, and to document thousands of such individuals directly, to hear their voices and description of the lives they live and the conditions under which they work, which, needless to say, are fraught with hazard, coercion, and subhuman, often hazardous and dangerous conditions. And the crucial element here is no country is immune and virtually no sector is immune. That's the astounding thing about slavery in the modern context. It's not just agriculture, construction, and trade work as it was centuries ago. It's everything. It's manufacturing, it's the commercial sex sector, it's mining, it's agriculture, dozens of products in the agricultural sector, seafood. You can just go on down the list of the great industries across the global economy. And at the bottom of their various and variegated supply chains, you'll invariably find severe labor exploitation, and in the worst cases, slavery and child labor.
And so I understand the comprehensiveness of what you just said there, but which particular sectors have you been focusing on more recently?
Well, the last few years, I have been very focused on issues in cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. For your listeners who may not know, cobalt is in our lives every day. It allows rechargeable batteries found in every single phone, tablet, laptop, and electric vehicle to, in fact, recharge. Those batteries would not recharge without cobalt. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo is source to 70% of the world's supply of cobalt. And it is mined in utterly horrific, devastating, and subhuman conditions that involve mass environmental destruction, grievous injury to thousands upon thousands of the poorest and most vulnerable people of the Congo, as well as death through tunnel collapses, toxic exposure, and even violence from military forces on the ground. It is, to be honest, the most extreme and sharp example of modern slavery. And I say that because of all the sectors I've researched, cobalt mining in the Congo has the widest asymmetry between the share of value at the top of the chain, and by that I mean some of the biggest and most powerful and rich companies in the world that sell us phones, tablets, and cars, and the pennies that are sprinkled down to the bottom of the chain, and that too in conditions of utter inhumanity. And that really is the essence of modern slavery.
So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the process of extraction to get into some of the detail. I mean, you've physically been there, you've seen the mines. Can you tell us a little bit about, is this digging by hand? Is this like the gairimperos of Brazil who dig gold by hand? Is it that sort of fundamentally basic in terms of extraction?
Yes, you're right. I've been to the Congo many times. I've been to the mining areas, and just for context, 70% of the world's supply of cobalt comes out of a fairly small patch of the Congo, a rectangle that's about 80 kilometers by 400 kilometers in the southeastern corner of the country, if people want to look at a map, right at the Zambian border. And yes, there are some large mining companies, all foreign, big mining companies on the ground with excavators and tractors and haulers and so forth. But 30 to 40% of the cobalt supply is mined by peasants by hand. That means little mallets, chisels, and shovel. Because of the geography of the southeastern Congo, there's no other place in the world where this took place. Mineral deposits were thrust upward. So they're available and accessible to shallow depths. You don't have to dig a shaft a kilometer down to get to the deposits there. You can just dig a tunnel, maybe 20, 30 meters down. Oftentimes cobalt's right at the surface. So peasants and villagers go into these informal areas with hacks and picks and shovels. They dig out the deposits, many of which have radioactive uranium in them. So there's vicious toxic exposure there, radioactive exposure. Cobalt itself is toxic. Using their hands, breathing the dust, they have no PPE of any kind. They fill up sacks of stones that contain cobalt, and then it flows through this informal marketplace and then into the formal supply chain. So there's this layer of informality of traders and buying houses in between the child labor and the peasant labor and the forced labor and the big flashy mining companies and consumer tech companies. If you go into these areas where there's artisanal mining, and don't be fooled by the word, there's nothing quaint and artisanal about it. You are transported back centuries to a time when mining involved brute interaction with the earth, digging of tunnels, being covered in dirt and filth. And in the worst cases, because it is so low tech, these tunnels that the villagers dig to get to the deposits, they don't have supports and beams and things like that. So they collapse. They collapse all the time. And anyone who's down there and everyone who's down there is buried alive. And that's the cost of of recharging our batteries.
So that raises a number of really important issues. And before I turn to Hannah, I just want to ask a final question, because you mentioned the location close to the Zambian border, right in the southeast corner of Congo. And it's this idea of the maps that interests me, because I understand that in one of your last trips to Congo, you actually took a GPS location device with you, and you could actually geolocate these sites. And then that data from the geolocation can be used for further analysis using satellite imagery and the so-called slavery from space technologies developed here at the university. Can you tell us a little bit about how that went for you?
Yes, well, this was the brilliant idea of some of our colleagues at the Rights Lab. You know, artisanal mines have a very distinctive appearance from above. It has the appearance of people who have just been digging up the earth, almost kind of like a lunar, craterous appearance. And so the idea we had is, the next time I went down there, I took these GPS units and I tagged a fairly random sample of these artisanal sites spread across that sort of geo-fenced area in the southeastern provinces. So there's the crater lunar surface digging, and then there's tunnel digging, which again from above looks like a sort of 1 meter diameter hole in the ground. And that's sort of what you see from above. And then you can see hundreds and hundreds of them all next to each other. But what you can't see on the ground is everything. There's remote sites in hills and mountains that are very difficult to get to. And it's impossible to cover the universe of such sites. But from above, with the satellite technology, you can do that. With a sufficient sample of geotagged sites, our colleagues at the Rights Lab were able to run some software that allowed the algorithm to recognize other sites just like that within this rectangle in the southeastern Congo, to create the first sort of map of the known universe of artisanal mining. And the last thing I'll say on that, which is fascinating, is if you time lapse it, look at the same rectangle 10 years ago, and then look at it today, you can also see the amount of environmental devastation that has taken place in digging up not just the artisanal mines, but especially the industrial operations, because they just explode in tens of square miles in size, which means deforestation. And that can be quantified, and that's something we'll be working on.
That's amazing. So this kind of scaling up, if you will, from the micro mine itself and the person digging all the way up to a visualization of the whole sector, but yeah, also reaching back in time. And I guess for our listeners, it's important to explain that there are image banks that do go back in time. So satellite photos of that same region 10 years ago can be accessed and analyzed against the images for the current period, and you can actually see that evolution over time. So I wonder if I might turn to Hannah now. Now, Hannah, Siddharth raises some really just fundamental questions here that, what we buy, what we consume. Oftentimes we think, oh, now in the era of remote working, I must get another device. I need an iPhone. I need, a nice laptop. I need to connect to the Wi-Fi, etc. But a lot of these products are predicated on the availability of rechargeable batteries. We use them every day. We charge them every day. And yet the supplies for those batteries, as we've just heard, come, one would say, under conditions of duress. And what Siddharth actually lays out is this informal to the formal. You have the informal extraction, some sort of informal bartering system, and then a formal supplier that then works its way up through the chain. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, you worked with supermarkets, you've worked with other corporate organizations in the world. Is this typical, this sort of supply chain, the steps, the invisibility of certain steps, the greater visibility of other steps in the chain? What could you say about what Siddharth shared with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's unfortunately totally typical of what you would see in any global value chain, global production network, global supply chain. The complexity, as it's often referred to, comes from multiple buyers in different countries, different states. But I would say that the problems are too often blamed on this complexity. Ultimately, we're now a very globalized, connected world, and in many ways that's a positive thing. But too many people think that just the complexity of a supply chain means that exploitation, to the degree that Siddharth has explained, is unavoidable. And actually, it's not necessarily about that. Yes, it contributes, but it's much more about the instability of relationships and the instability of connections between those different stages of the global value networks, and in particular the imbalance of power between the actors. So whenever there is an imbalance of anything, things become weaker, and the same goes for our global supply chains. And we can unfortunately only expect that to continue and prevail whilst this imbalance of power between the buyer at the top of the supply chain is forcing down on those at the base, who are typically the most vulnerable and those in the most precarious situations.
Yeah, and the other thing that struck me is that Siddharth said this is 70% of cobalt supply comes from this one area. Now, typically market solutions, if you will, in terms of fair trade and consumer pressure, etc., means that consumers can substitute other suppliers. They can move to other regions of the world. Coffee is a good example. For example, it's grown in many, many countries in the world. But the absolute concentration of supply makes this actually fundamentally different and perhaps even more difficult to tackle.
Yes, absolutely. They've got an awful lot of power, and they are always going to be in demand. And so market imbalances again, and the lack of ability to compete, and the need to use this region where state regulation and other infrastructure is not available, just adds to the problem. I mean, you can question whether buying companies and organizations in more developed nations continue to purchase from there ultimately because they know there is very little legislation and very few loopholes to have to adhere to, or you can, suggest that, as is also partly true, which is that it is the prime place to get certain materials from. But unfortunately, both of those aspects contribute to making it a really imbalanced supply chain and leaving those with the money at the top in the most powerful position. And recent research has shown that it's not complexity, but it is just these power imbalances that are relied upon to force labour standards down the supply chain, which are causing the problems. And ultimately, pushing them down through power is not a sustainable or successful way of doing it. There needs to be much more cohesion and communication, which is possible in our very connected world. It's just not desired at the moment by many of those purchasing these products.
So I was going to ask Siddharth about this. You talked about, the value add, so very small at the bottom end, and then increasingly value gets added as you get to the top, and then the distribution of that value stays concentrated at the top. So, we'll get to sort of legal challenge in a moment, but I'm curious about a distributional solution here, that somehow that value could be forcibly redistributed and made more fairly distributed, not only improving the conditions of how this stuff is extracted, but equally that the sort of money earned from the activity could somehow be redistributed. Or is that just fundamentally impossible from a political and a kind of power understanding of this situation?
I've thought about this so much, and in this sector, cobalt mining, and in so many others, apparel workers working for 10, 12 cents an hour for major Western brands, and one can go down the list and say, well, why is it that such an anemic share of value makes its way down to the bottom? And that's sort of the construct and nature of contemporary global capitalism. It sort of amasses and concentrates value at the top and shares down the minimum that the system, regulatory or otherwise, requires. And right now, that value is virtually nil. People work in the Congo in toxic conditions, suffering injury and death for about $1, maybe $2 per day. So that's 10, 20 cents an hour. And yet phones at the top end are sold at robust margins. Same with electric vehicles. These companies have tens of billions of dollars in the bank account, let alone market caps exceeding trillions of dollars. So it frankly would really just be a matter of simple will and desire to be more equitable, to share even a rounding error on their balance sheet would be utterly transformative to the conditions and lives on the ground. And the issue is they don't see the people at the bottom of the chain, all those levels down, as their employees. And that's the problem. But they are. But for the cobalt coming out of the Congo, you and I would not be talking on our gadgets right now.
Right, and that's a fundamental observation. I think this idea of the rounding error of the balance sheet is a pull-out quote if I've ever heard one. The size and scale of the balance sheet and the margin that would be needed to make the situation better almost overnight is quite small, actually.
That's exactly right. That's the great tragedy of it. It's the futility of the suffering. It doesn't need to be. It wouldn't take much. It would take two things: the will to be decent to the people at the bottom of the chain, and then the allocation. At least in this sector, it may not be true of every sector. Many sectors have much thinner margins. But at least in terms of global tech and the electric vehicle market, it is a rounding error on their balance sheets. They wouldn't notice it, but no one has yet compelled them. And to Hannah's point, it's this opacity of the supply chain. Everybody points their finger down at the next piece of the chain to say, no, they're responsible. And then that person points their finger down, and so on. No one accepts responsibility. And the last finger is pointed to the child scraping through muck and filth in the Congo, or the child working 14 hours a day and not going to school to sew our shirts, and so on and so forth. And when the last finger is pointed at them, that means they're left holding the bag. And the cycle will continue. So responsibility has to begin at the top. And when it does, all of these problems can be repaired.
So let me turn back to Hannah then. Siddharth uses some strong language there. And one was the language of compulsion. The other was a language of responsibility. And I suppose I'll throw a third one in there as the language of accountability. And so there seems to be, a slippage of accountability, certainly responsibility, but the role for compulsion, if we translate the word compulsion into legal frameworks and legal interventions, what sorts of things are being done on the corporate side? We've had a number of episodes on the rights track where we talk about voluntary codes of conduct, the UN Global Compact, the Ruggie principles, etc. But again, they feel voluntary. They don't feel compulsory. They don't feel like there's the real bite of the law and consequences for a violation of that law. So from an overview, perspective, Hannah, what sorts of things are being developed from the work that you've been doing?
I think beyond what you've just mentioned there, Todd, the biggest things to pull out are specific legislation around modern slavery reporting, which are becoming a little bit more well known and established in various developed countries. The UK was the first to bring in their Modern Slavery Act, which is now being followed by Australia. And we're hopeful that Canada are also going to follow suit, and various European countries. But even then, you talk about the teeth of the law and consequences. And actually, there's massive holes in even this legislation that's coming through. For those that don't know, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, as an example of that first piece of legislation, requires businesses with turnovers of over 36 million to report on what they're doing to address modern slavery in their business and supply chains. But for instance, even the language is not strong enough in my opinion, and in many others, in that, it's called a modern slavery statement, but I always say it should be called a modern slavery strategy. This should be about focusing on what that business is doing to hold itself accountable to these things that are happening in every industry and sector, as Siddharth noted. And the most important part of those strategies should be the targets, holding themselves to account, reporting year on year what they've achieved, what they've found out. And actually, far too many businesses are adhering to the letter of the law by simply saying the same thing about the due diligence activities they do each year.
Yes, it suggests that there should be some sort of key performance indicator framework and action plan for achieving them, and a monitoring and evaluation program that says, well, okay, you've said you're going to do X. Did you do X? Did it make a difference? And can you demonstrate how it made a difference? That sort of closing of the loop, if you will. So I wonder if, Siddharth, if you could tell us a little bit about, I know you've written some stuff in The Guardian about this and other outlets. Are you involved in legal activity around any of what you've been doing in Congo?
My plan when I took my first trip to the Congo was to gather research on the conditions and ultimately try to find support to do a broad academic study and bring the facts to the world of what was happening in this industry. I wrote a piece in The Guardian after that trip, an encounter I had that really transformed my thinking. I think it was just that it was one of the final encounters of that trip, and I was really at the end of my tether emotionally. A young girl named Elodie with an infant on her back, and there were thousands of them that I had seen. But this young girl was in such a miserable condition, ill, caked in grit and mucus. Her 2 or 3 month old child was doomed from the start, and she was just hacking at the ground at this cobalt that we use in our phones and devices and cars. And after I saw her, I finally felt this problem is just too urgent, and I changed plan and thought I need to find something a little more immediate, and that was the idea of strategic litigation. So I sort of came back, gathered my mind, and went about trying to find an attorney to help me file litigation to hold companies accountable, to compel them to take accountability for their supply chains. And so I did that. I, with the help of colleagues on the ground, identified plaintiffs who were willing to speak, which is no small matter in the Congo, where there's violent reprisals for anyone who speaks against the state or against economic interests. But we found some people. I took their depositions, their statements. These were 14 plaintiffs, either the parents of children who had suffered grievous injury mining cobalt at mines linked to the defendants, in this case, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Dell, and Tesla, or parents who had lost a child at one of those mines. The child perished. And then I engaged a human rights attorney to file a suit, and this was towards the end of last year, but it has moved very slowly on account of COVID, which has brought delays into the legal machinery for understandable reasons, of course.
In whose jurisdiction are you filing this suit?
We filed suit in U.S. federal court in Washington, D.C., against these defendants. Mind you, there could be another dozen or so defendants easily in this country and dozens more abroad. And phase 2 is I'm working on finding attorneys to help me in some other countries, including the UK, to bring claims under whatever the relevant laws of those countries are, even if the case is not successful. Needless to say, these are massive companies with great power and influence. It's the opportunity for voices to be heard that are otherwise voiceless, for people to be able to speak who are otherwise completely suppressed and muffled. And it is part of what I hope will be a step towards a system or a regime, even regulation, in which companies not just have a reporting requirement, as Hannah rightfully noted, but have some actual tangible obligation with the threat of a penalty, a meaningful penalty, if they don't ensure that their supply chains from start to finish, top to bottom, are clean of child labor, forced labor, slavery, labor abuse, as well as massive environmental destruction.
Amazing summary, and the courage it takes to file these suits, as well as the time commitment, etc. And I think this observation about the probability of success and your realism about that is refreshing. And I wonder if I ask Hannah, in terms of this gap between the probability of legal success versus just giving people a voice, that their voice will be heard in areas that hadn't been heard before. Is that a slow road to progress, do you think?
I think it's the right road to progress, whatever pace we're going at. And it's incredibly important that somebody is now challenging these big conglomerates who for so long have been able to do exactly what they want without this level of scrutiny. So yes, it might not happen immediately, but I'm sure the people that Siddharth has met and now know are represented at some level, it will mean everything to them. And it's incredibly important that this kind of process is now becoming, I hope it can become the norm. We talk a lot in the Rights Lab about monitoring and evaluation and the need for businesses to do this to a larger extent. So often businesses focus on reporting what they've done, their philanthropic activity, how they've approached their risk and monitoring. But actually sitting and reflecting on what that has achieved is something that's still severely lacking from any kind of corporate responsibility processes. And there's a number of reasons: resource, expertise, fear to an extent, and also probably pace. These businesses work at such high pace with conflicting priorities. There's rarely time to do this. But it's also because not enough people ask the detail that's needed about the activities they talk about as being positive. And all the businesses Siddharth has now challenged have fantastic corporate responsibility reports online that, if you don't ask those further questions of, will continue to be able to get away with this for years to come.
It's interesting, the CEOs of the companies that were named, we often see currently making pronouncements about the US response to COVID or other country response to COVID or development of vaccines or new technologies that take us to space, etc. How do we shift the conversation and say, that's all great, we like the contribution you're making, the philanthropic arm of your operations is very much well received. However, we have a few other things we'd like you to think about and address. How does that shift in culture take place? How does that awareness raising, how do you get this onto the agenda in a way that's meaningful and powerful? And I guess I want to ask that to you, Hannah, and then also ask the same question to Siddharth.
Sure. So I think it's like, I think Siddharth said, there needs to be the will, but ultimately that hasn't worked. And so therefore we've got to give these companies and these CEOs the business case to act more responsibly, to ask the questions that they haven't asked so far, because it's simply not acceptable to not know where your products you're selling are coming from. And for me, that comes back to them understanding this idea of risk and resilience. And COVID has been a fantastic example of where businesses who clearly hadn't paid enough attention to how resilient their supply chains were, the ways that they make money, the where about their products come from, that create that bottom line that they celebrate every year in a very, very financial manner. What else relies on that, and what else needs to be in place to keep them successful? And ultimately showing to them that having a weakness in any part of your supply chain, being it labor related, being it logistics related, communication related, will be a risk to them in future is critical. Because if people don't understand risks, they severely undervalue resilience. And if they're not resilient, they won't continue to be successful. And so for me, we need to find a way to make that message clearer to the CEOs of the businesses we're talking about.
And Siddharth, your work is on the ground research, feet in the mud, sort of meeting the absolute affected communities, capturing those stories and portraits, converting that to a legal claim, being realistic about the legal challenge, but at the same time still committed to changing will, culture, and attitudes. Does that fairly summarize your agenda for the next several years?
What Hannah and I are talking about, what so many people in the modern slavery world are discussing and working on, is just the latest chapter in a long history, a long legacy, and we can't forget that. The global North has been enslaving, pillaging, trafficking, exploiting the global South for centuries. They went down into Africa, moved people from there, schlepped them across oceans, and enslaved them. Then they colonized the continent. And it was all about extracting cheap labor, resources to enrich the global North. And it may not be nation states anymore. It's now their children and grandchildren, multinational corporations, but it's the same process of pillaging resources, exploiting labor, and amassing and extracting massive amounts of value into the hands of the northern half of the planet. And that's the thing we're working on. And so what will it take to end that story? I mean, we're seeing that now on the streets, right? It took George Floyd being lynched by the knee of a white police officer to get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world saying enough. And you saw in England the statues of slave traders being yanked down and tossed into rivers, and the same across Europe. I think there's a reckoning happening, and I think this generation coming up now will be the one to compel change. I do have that hope, so that this nearly endless repeated history, chapter after chapter, of the pillage and rapine of the global South being perpetuated by the economic and political interests of the North can finally be put to rest, and some decency and fairness and equity for the people south of the Tropic of Capricorn can finally be achieved.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you very much. And this idea of reckoning hope and maybe closing the repeated chapters once and for all does give us all a lot to think about here today. So I'd like to say, on behalf of the Rights Track, thank you very much to Siddharth Kara and Hannah Lerigo-Stephens for their contributions today on this episode of the Rights Track.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and first large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery. Don't forget to join us on Twitter @RightsTrack and to subscribe wherever you find your podcasts.